Welcome to the Bywords Show. I'm your host, Hannah Hughes. Bywords is all about equipping women for purposeful living by starting conversations, celebrating stories, and inspiring faith. In a world that applauds the hustle, I'm here to help you break free from the lies and come back to what really matters. It's time to get real, get rooted in truth, and come alive in relationship with Jesus so you can show up to each day with intention and confidence no matter where you're at in your story. Here we believe that embracing our stories brings hope, healing, and purpose to the process, and sharing our stories helps others do the same. Whether you're looking for a midweek faith refresh, practical tools for pursuing your dreams, or just need some good old-fashioned girl talk, you're in the right place. Grab your latte and let's dive in. Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Bywords Show. I'm so glad you're here. Today is the day, y'all. Setup looks a little different. If you're watching the video, I usually have my little background, but today was such a sweet day. I actually went for a little early birthday getaway with my sister Emma, and it started snowing here, and it's nighttime. The kids are in bed, so I'm just cozy, and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to sit down and do this episode really chill, really chit chat style because this is a big one, y'all. I'm turning 30 on the 18th of this month, and I've just been reflecting and processing the last decade, and it's crazy. So, today, what I want to share is my journey through my 20s, including some key lessons that I've learned along the way that I would want to pass on to somebody else in each of these years of their 20s. So, I'm going to share some stories that I've never shared and hopefully encourage you if you're in your 20s or if you are in a similar season to any of these stages of my life that I'm going to share. Also, I'm sorry, I realized recently that my mic is sounding like really scratchy, and I realized I think it's because I dropped it a few weeks ago. So if the audio is really scratchy or if it sounds weird, I won't know until I'm editing this, but I'm sorry. It's actually on my birthday wish list / Christmas / whenever I'm able to get a new mic so that we can get that crispy podcast audio that we all know and love. So anyway, little side note. I do want to pause really quickly before we get into it and ask you a big favor for my birthday. It would mean so much to me if you love me, if you love the Bywords Show, if you enjoy hanging out with us over here. Could you just quickly pause and leave a rating and review? It really helps me, number one, know that this content is encouraging you and helping you. And also, it helps get this podcast in front of more people. So it would mean the world to me and be the best birthday present ever if I could go and see your review. So anyway, if you don't mind, go and do that. Thank you in advance, and then come back and let's dive into this. So let's go all the way back to 2014, which is the year that I turned 20. To set the stage, I was at Christ for the Nations Institute in Dallas to study worship ministry, and I had a great time there. I made so many great friends, and at the same time, I also was in a really interesting season because I had just finished my first year at this Bible college and had published my very first book, which is my devotional Love Is. I actually went through it's really funny. I went through my old photos and my Instagram feed also, and I took screenshots of photos and what my feed looked like for every single year that correlates like to these years in my 20s. So it kind of works out that I have this blank background here. So if you're watching the video, I'll try to add in pictures. Boop, right here. This is me when I turned 20. And actually, this picture is me with my friend Allie right after I released Love Is. So, Love Is my first book. It's a devotional about love. We actually have gone through a mini series on the podcast that goes along with the study if you're interested. It was really sweet being able to do that, but I cannot believe it's been 10 years since that book came out. It's my very first book since the birth of me being an author, which is just crazy. Around that same time during my 20th year, I also went on my first overseas mission trip, which was with Christ for the Nations. And we went to the UK. So I went to England and I went to Ireland, and I absolutely fell in love with the UK. I fell in love particularly with Ireland, and I met some just really amazing people there that I'm still in contact with. Ended up eventually going back to sea, which I'll share again when we get to that year. But it was just a really cool year for me. I felt like I was trying new things. And I would say the biggest lesson for my 20th year, and really to set the stage for my 20s, was just learning not to be afraid to get uncomfortable and try new things. I used to be so afraid. Oh my gosh, I used to struggle with fear so much. I used to worry what people would think of me. I was so afraid of failing that I didn't want to try unless I was sure that it would be perfect. And that held me back for a really long time. And so, beginning my 20s, I really started to let myself try a few things and, like going overseas for the first time, writing my book and publishing it and putting it out in the world, starting to figure out who I wanted to be in the world, which is such an interesting time, like the transition from high school to college and then into your 20s, figuring out who you are and who you want to be and processing all of that. Such an interesting time. But that's kind of how my 20s started out. While all of that was going on, I was also in a really horrible relationship, and there was just a lot of factors that went into it. I actually, when I turned 20, started to have a lot of triggers coming up about my sexual abuse. And at that point, I had never dealt with it. I hadn't told my parents, hadn't told anyone about it, had never gotten help or therapy or anything. And it was really feeding into this relationship. And so both of us were just really unhealthy dealing with stuff. I got to a point where I was like, okay, I can no longer avoid or ignore the fact that this part of me needs healing. So I also started the journey towards getting help and healing for that. So that was my 20th year. Then comes 2015 when I turned 21. And I think actually my 21st birthday was like on a Monday or something. And so it wasn't fun. Like, I don't remember doing anything super exciting for my 21st birthday. But this was a really interesting year for me because I had originally planned on going to CFNI for 3 years to finish my worship program and get that degree. But I ended up moving back home and I felt like I just didn't know what I was doing in my life. Like, I really got to this point where my boyfriend and I had broken up. I was healing from that breakup. I was healing from my sexual abuse and trauma. And I was also like processing all of this other junk in my life that I had tried to avoid and ignore and like brush under the rug for years. So this was a really tough year for me. Like, moving home felt like a huge step back, like moving back in with my parents after being on my own. And then also just feeling like, what the heck am I doing with my life? I remember around that time, I also went back to working at Smoothie King, which was my high school job. And honestly, I loved that job. But I just remember that year being a really tough time for me, just trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do with my life and what does God want me to do? And anyway, so I moved back home from Dallas to be with my parents again. During that same year, I actually went to a worship school at Bethel, and that was a really cool moment as well. Like, I feel like during all of that craziness, being able to go there kind of set me on a different trajectory, which I'll explain in a second. But I have to do a little side note here because during this year was actually the same year that I met Christopher, who is my husband now. And we did not start dating right away. Actually, when we met, it was in passing the week that my boyfriend and I broke up. So it was just like nothing there, but it was just the first time we met and interacted. So that was going on when I was 21. My brother had also decided to go to LA and do his YWAM school, which is Youth with a Mission. And so during that year, I also went out there to visit him. And I actually ended up staying out there for a couple months being a nanny to one of the other ladies who was there. And it was just really interesting. Like, I had no idea what I was doing with my life. And so, like, going to Bethel, I went to that worship school and had a great experience. I loved it. But at that time, I still wasn't sure what was next for me. I was kind of bummed that I didn't finish my worship school at CFNI. So I actually had planned to go to Bethel's School of Ministry. I actually had an apartment and roommates, and I was accepted into the school and was planning to move in the fall. And then all of a sudden, I felt like God was changing my plans after I visited my brother in LA, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I think I'm supposed to go to LA. I think I'm supposed to do this ministry school here instead." So I ended up deciding not to go to Bethel, which was crazy. I felt so bad because I was like, I'm going to let my roommates down. What are we going to do? Like, they're going to be so annoyed with me. I didn't know how to tell them, but I actually got a text from one of the girls who was going to be one of my roommates saying that she actually had heard from God and she wasn't going to go either. So I was like, okay, God's doing something here. I don't feel as crazy for deciding not to go so last minute. I will say a key part of processing all of that during that year when I was 21 was I got a mentor. My mom has a friend that went to their church for a really long time, and I started meeting with her, and she was just helping me process my mindset, mental health, my like physical health, and like my eating disorder recovery stuff, and food and body image, and like what does this look like in relationship to pursuing the Lord and living a life of faith. I would say my two biggest lessons for my 21st year were find a mentor. Find someone, if you are able to speak into your life, to be accountability, to show you your blind spots, and to encourage you in your faith, because we need people to kind of coach us through some seasons. And it is just, it makes a huge difference. Okay. So find a mentor. I would also say a big lesson that I learned that year was don't be afraid to ask God your hard questions. You can hear his voice. I used to struggle so much and doubt that I could actually hear God's voice or know if he was trying to speak to me, but he speaks to his people and we can hear his voice. And another, gosh, this was a big year, I feel like, because the biggest thing that I learned, I think, was that it's worth it to let go when God leads you to, whether it's a plan, whether it's a dream, a relationship, whatever it is. Like if God is leading you to lay something down and surrender, it's because he has something better. And that can be really hard and uncomfortable, but this is where faith comes in, right? I learned a lot through this challenging season of being back at home and things not going the way I planned them to. But it ended up being a really cool moment for my faith that served kind of as a launch pad to put me into this next season. Which brings us to 2016. I am looking down over here because I have like my notes. I actually, it's really extra. Okay. But I actually, while I was preparing for this, not just for this episode, but also just like praying and preparing for my birthday and reflecting on all that God has done, I went through my New Year's Eve letters that I write to myself every year. I started those in 2013. So I was like, oh, that's perfect. Like that's, a decade's worth of things that I documented. And so I went through and I like made notes of all the highlights from each year and what I was doing in life. And then like the main things that I feel like God taught me during that time. So that's why I have like this whole notes situation over here. It's funny. I don't usually have like handwritten notes, but it was fun reflecting and kind of processing this way. 2016 comes and I turned 22 that year. I had decided to go to YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission, and do a discipleship training school. Now, during this year, Christopher and I actually ended up reconnecting in the summer. So I had already decided, like, hey, I'm going to go do this mission school and I'm not going to change my plans. I feel like this is what God's calling me to do. And he was like, yeah, that's great. Sounds great. I'll be here when you get back. And I really was thinking, this guy doesn't know what he's getting himself into. Like, we're going to be long distance for a long time. I'm going to be overseas. Like, we may not get to talk to each other for a while. And then I learned that he actually grew up in Asia as a missionary kid. So he was totally familiar with this life and was extremely supportive. So it ended up working out and being really cool. We reconnected, we were dating, and then I left for YWAM. So YWAM was a ride. There's a lot of thoughts around YWAM, and I won't share all of mine because I don't think it's helpful or necessary, but it was good and hard in a lot of ways. And mine was called Beauty Arise, and we did a lot in the fashion and entertainment industry. And we also worked with like sex trafficking, like red light districts, that kind of thing. It was a lot. We went to Mexico, we went to Greece and France. We spent so much time just working with refugees and people in brothels and other ministries doing things like that. And there was a lot that happened on that trip that I am happy to say I am over, like I have healed from. There was a lot of actually hurt that happened with leadership, and there was just a lot to it. But out of that season and experience, I actually also did make one of the best friends I've ever had, my friend Phoebe, who I ended up going to see when I was pregnant with Della. I got to go and see her in Australia, and it was just so sweet being able to reconnect with her after all these years. So I would say the biggest lesson that I learned when I was 22 was to hold your dreams and plans with an open hand. And not out of a place of fear, like, okay, Lord, like, I don't know if it'll actually happen. I don't know if I can really trust you. Like, I don't want to get my hopes up kind of mentality, but out of a place of like, Lord, I give these to you and I expect your goodness, whether it's this or something better. It's actually really sweet. My mom used to always say, when I would pray about things, I think I've shared this on the show before, but when I was in high school, my mom always used to say, if you're praying about something, just say, Lord, let it be this or something better. And I used to be really annoyed by that because I was like, no, I just want this thing. And it's humbling to realize we don't always know what's best, but it is really cool when we get to a place in our faith where we can trust that God is good and always wants the best for us. So that's why learning to hold our dreams and our plans and all of these things that we desire with an open hand is really important, because when we believe that our God is good and that he loves us and he wants good things for us, whether that means, blessing us and giving us favor or letting us go through refining seasons that make us uncomfortable, like he knows what's best and we can trust him so we can hold it with an open hand. Okay, moving to 2017. This is a year that I turned 23. This is also the year that I got engaged and married to Christopher. I just have to say, the transitions that year, it was a lot. This is the year where I had left for my mission school. We had done long distance, overseas long distance. As soon as I was done with that school, we got engaged. We got married 4 months later. Then we were living together. So going from long distance to living together, and then realizing that I had a bunch of hurt that I needed to heal from. So, not only like being confronted with new triggers for my sexual trauma, but also like realizing that coming out of this experience was like being in a bubble and like a pressure cooker. Like, if like any kind of ministry training or Bible school or anything like that. Like, it's just very much this bubble where everything is full on. Like, your whole life is just faith and Bible study and community and worship and prayer. And then you come into the real world again. And that reentry is sometimes really tricky. So it was a really tough adjustment for me. But during this year is actually when I started going to therapy. And it was one of the best decisions I made for myself in a long time, to just find a Christian counselor who could walk with me through everything. And I actually stayed with her. Like, I continued seeing that counselor until this year when we moved to Colorado. So it just made such a huge impact in my life to have somebody helping me process all of that, because I used to be somebody that felt like I couldn't feel the hard stuff. Like, I needed to just suppress it. I used to stuff down my feelings until they would bubble up and explode by some sort of trigger, which is exactly what happened after Christopher and I got married. And I was confronted with this complete new reality. It was kind of like culture shock, coming from something so different and now this new life, that I was like, hold on, I have to relearn everything. So I would say the biggest lesson that I learned that year is to give yourself permission to feel the hard stuff, which sucks. But I've heard it said before, you have to feel to heal. You don't have to hide it. Like, hiding your emotions and suppressing your emotions, that's not going to help you. It's going to end up coming back to bite you if you just try to stuff it down and ignore it. And so this is a time in my life where I realized it's not weakness, it's not wrong to struggle with emotions or mental health or to have these challenges. And it's okay to not be okay. And so I started to just let myself feel these things and feel through them and process. And that is what brought a lot of healing in my life. And then we moved to 2018, which is the year that I turned 24. Gosh, this was a wild year. I remember this is the year where I started to post a lot more on social media. And this was the time where everything was very aesthetic. Everything was about like having great pictures. And I really did think, oh, if I have great pictures, then more people will care what I have to say and I'll get more followers. And I was trying to be the Instagram girl, the VSCO girl. And I will say it was really fun. I really enjoyed like sharing my coffee. And this is when I kind of started to build this little tiny Instagram community and make some new friends and just kind of like, I don't know, step into this new season of being a married adult mid-20s person. And I just remember that was a really fun time. We did end up going to Ireland for our first anniversary, which was so sweet, because when we went, I was able to go back and see some of those friends that I met on the mission trip that I went to when I was at CFNI. And that was really special that Christopher got to experience it with me. And then he also fell in love with the UK. This was also the year that I did my coach certification training. That was wild and so fun. I did this intensive with Coach Academy International in Dallas, where it was 2 weeks full on intensive in-person training. And I loved every minute of it. It was so much fun. Right before I decided to do this coaching training, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life again. Do I go back to college? Do I finish a degree? Do I do something else? Like, I don't know really what I want to do. And then I met someone who was a coach and she coached me. And in this session, I was like, what in the world? This exists? Like, I didn't know there was something that's so similar to therapy, but it's more of like a partnership and like a facilitation conversation. And I just loved it. And it just really got me passionate about coaching and helping other women and just like learning how I can be just this guide helping people to process their feelings and their dreams and their goals. And it was just really cool being able to help people like brainstorm and set goals because I love that kind of stuff. And this was also a year where even though I had a lot going on, I started to feel really lonely. We had just recently started going to a new church when we were engaged. And so we'd been there for about like, I don't know, 6 months to a year by the time I turned 24. It just felt really lonely because we were in a different season of now trying to figure out married life and what does it look like for both of us to be pursuing our careers. And Christopher was starting his photography business and I was doing all of my creative stuff. And I started to work with brands and do like campaigns with social media. And so it was just this really weird time of transition, I would say. The lesson I learned that year was really just you got to make community a priority. So easy to isolate yourself. At least for me, I do. Like when I start to struggle, I isolate myself. And sometimes I back myself into a corner and I'm not intentional about putting myself out there or reaching out to people or asking for help. This is the time in my life where I really realized that number one, feeling lonely doesn't mean you have to be alone. You're not the only one that's struggling. You're not the only one that feels that way. And then also, just community can make such a huge difference in your life. And so I started to attend small groups at our church. And this is around the time that we started getting plugged into the worship ministry at the church we were going to at the time. And so it just really made a huge difference for us. Like, having community around us. It was a struggle getting there, but now I know from that experience, community is priceless. I say it all the time. Y'all know we cannot do purpose without people. And this is actually the year and the season where that whole heart and passion came out of. Okay, this is where it gets wild, y'all. Here we are, middle of the 20s. In 2019, this is when I turned 25. This is also the year that I found out I was pregnant with Jude, our first little guy. And it was just such a wild year because I was pregnant with Jude, had him in October that year, and then I turned 25 in November that year. During my 25th year, like going into 2020, is when I launched the Bywords community group, which I don't know if y'all remember if some of the OG people are around, but it was so fun. Like I remember having Jude and when he was a baby, like just feeling this new weight to my life and feeling like, I don't even know how to explain it. It was like, I wanted to pursue the Lord and his plans for my life so wholeheartedly to set that example for our kids. And it was just really cool. Like, I don't know, if you're a parent, maybe you can relate. It just puts things in perspective for you. And it kind of like puts a new weight to like how you spend your time and the things you're saying yes to. And obviously, there are different things that change when you become a mom. And so it was just a lot of like relearning life as a mom. Definitely the lesson I learned that year was a lot can change in a year so much, whether it's good or bad or, positive or negative. Just so much can happen in a year. Your mindset and your attitude has a lot to do with that. But a big thing that I also learned during that season was that it's okay if you don't feel like motherhood is coming naturally to you at first. It's okay. I felt that way. I feel like it took me a long time to catch my stride. And I used to beat myself up about it and feel like it should be easier. Like I should be better at this, or why doesn't it feel like sweet and perfect like everybody said it would be or like I thought it would be, and it's okay. Like if motherhood feels hard and uncomfortable and it feels like I don't know if I know what I'm doing, that is normal and that's okay. And again, a lot can change in a year. So give yourself grace. Give yourself so much patience and space to learn when you become a mom. Like that is such a huge transition. Then we get to 2020, which was a whirlwind, as we all know. This is the year I turned 26. I spent a lot of 2020 figuring out mom life and trying to figure out a new rhythm. 2020 was also the year that I relaunched my book, Love Is, and I got really obsessed with personal development. I feel like it started out with good intentions. There was a lot going on in 2020, and so many people were talking about how you can use this time to grow or you can waste this time at home. And I really leaned into the whole like, I got to make the most of this time. I went a little bit overboard, but I mean, I was just growing and going in 2020. I read so many self-help books and personal development books, and I was just trying to be my best self. And, like also postpartum, trying to find myself again. And like, what does it look like to be a working mom? And by the end of the year, I ended up really burnt out and exhausted. And it was no surprise why. Like I was hustling. This was the year where I just really had a pivotal moment in my life and in my faith where I realized this is not sustainable. And this is the biggest lesson I learned that year, that doing a lot of good stuff can still lead to burnout if it's not the right stuff. That was hard for me because I am such an achiever and a go getter and a goal setter, and I want to do my best. But when you have a hustle mentality and when you're chasing dreams and goals and pursuing things passionately, what we often forget is that rest isn't taking away from that. I was very much in the train of thought that felt resting was slacking off from achieving my goals or getting to where I needed to be in life, or like even doing effective kingdom work. And so this was the year where by the end of it, I realized something's got to change. I love this. Like, I love learning how I can grow as a person and be better and healthier and wiser, like even in my faith, but it just got to a point where I was like, okay, this is very out of balance and we need to get the scales a little bit more in alignment. Oh, my hatch just came on. It's telling me it's time to wind down. We're not done here, but I will take that as a sign to wrap it up. That's okay. We're more than halfway through, okay? So 2021 comes, and this is the year that I turned 27. Oh my gosh. This was a really major year for me in like a lot of positive and negative, like hard ways. I got really into personal development, like I said, and I fell in love with reading again. But going into 2021, I was like, okay, I've got to chill out. I'm just getting maxed out on information. I'm just getting burnt out. I can't even retain any more information. So I challenged myself to break up my nonfiction self help book reading with adding in some fiction, having fun. Like, I got to a point where I was like not enjoying life anymore because I was taking everything so seriously. And so this is the year where I actually really got back into reading, and I just fell in love with new genres and fantasy and historical fiction and mystery thrillers. And it became such a sweet way for me to rest, which was a huge piece that had been missing for me in the past. So reading was a really cool thing, like in my life. And I actually did a podcast episode about how reading changed my life. If you want to go back and like hear some book talk, it's really fun. This was also a year where I got to go on a really cool brand photo shoot trip with Crown Free, which is a company that I've worked for the past 5 years. And when I lived in Texas, I did modeling for them as well. And we decided that we were going to go to Joshua Tree and shoot the new collection. It was the craziest, coolest experience ever. Like, we went to New Mexico, Arizona. We stopped in Joshua Tree. So much stuff. Like, it was just a really cool trip. And I actually did vlogs. At the time, I was trying to be a YouTuber, so I like did a bunch of vlogs and random stuff on like my personal vlog channel, which like it's still there, but if you look it up, you won't be impressed. Like, it's nothing fancy. But anyway, I I just remember that being such a fun time. Oh, hold on, I skipped something major. I started this podcast. In May 2021, I started the By Words podcast. It was so cool because the community was popping and we were having so much fun doing monthly trainings with guest speakers and the little Facebook community group. It was just, I was loving it so much that I wanted to find a way to get more content out and to have more women share their stories and their wisdom. Here came the By Words podcast. And around that same time, I had also relaunched my book, Love Is. And so that's when it got the cover facelift. It had my married name on it instead of my maiden name. And here we are almost 4 years later, I guess 3.5 technically. But yeah, the podcast was a huge moment for me, a huge dream that I had put off for a really long time. And yeah, I'm really glad that I started this because I love this space and I hope you do too. And as I'm saying this, I realized that I totally skipped including the year where I published my second book. When I was 21, I published my second book, which is Waking Up, Living Open. And actually, that book was what inspired a lot of By Words later on down the line. And I won't go too much into detail here because I share most of that story in, I think, the very first episode, the By Words story of this podcast, where you can hear like how we got from there to me starting By Words community and then the podcast. But yeah, anyway, okay, fast forward back to 2021. As I said, I went on that really cool brand trip. I was rocking and rolling, having so much fun reading and doing more social media work. And then right after that brand trip, I got home and I had my first miscarriage. I had just found out before that trip that I was pregnant, and I was just so excited. Like, it was just such a sweet time for us. Like, everything was going really well. And then this miscarriage came, and it really was so unexpected. It just shook me in every way. Like, it really, really rattled my faith, my mental health. I started struggling really badly with my mental health and my faith, and our marriage also like really took a hit during that time. I wanted to give up on everything. I wanted to give up on the podcast. I wanted to quit everything. Like, I wanted to quit life. I wanted to quit our marriage. I just had no hope. I had no motivation to keep going at that time. And it was really, really dark time in my life where I was feeling depressed and suicidal again for the first time since I had been a teenager. And I ended up taking a break from the podcast during that time just so that I could heal and rest and process. And I really wrestled with that because, coming from my hustle background, I was like, no, I have to keep going. I have to push through or I'm going to lose momentum. Like, what are people going to say if I just quit? Like, I don't want to be a quitter. I just needed to take a break. And that was really hard for me, but I'm really glad I did it. Yeah, that was one of the hardest years of my life. Through that year, like reflecting on it, it really taught me a lot about kind of continuing what I learned at the end of 2020. Like, at first, wasn't willing to take a break from the podcast. And that would not have been good for my mental health, my physical health, my emotional health, like even spiritually. I was just trying to push through as if nothing was wrong. And taking that break was really what I needed because one of the biggest lessons I learned that year was that if you wouldn't want the people who are watching you to replicate the life that you're living and the things that you're feeling as a result of that, maybe something needs to change. And that was a hard realization for me because I was just riding the high of like feeling so excited to be in this podcast world and sharing content and connecting with other women in this space. And at the same time, I was starting to feel burnt out again and hitting a wall because I didn't know how to cope with the pain of a miscarriage. It just was such a huge shock. If it was somebody that I was watching who was going through the same pain, I would hope that they would take a break and do what they needed to do to heal and rest and recover from that. Because pushing through something like that, like when we force our way through hard seasons and we don't actually like take the break that we need to just sit back and process what needs to be processed and heal what needs to be healed, it just perpetuates the pain and it takes so much longer to come to a place of healing. And so I just really got to that point during that break from the podcast, and it was a really really hard time for me. And then going into 2022, which is when I turned 28, I had my second and third miscarriage, and again, just really a hard time in my life. I started to see a light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. Not necessarily that I saw an end in sight, but I started to find my faith again. I had never gotten to a point where I was just so honest with God about my anger and my disappointment and my just hopelessness. And getting to that point where I felt like everything had fallen apart kind of got me to this place where I felt like, everything is falling apart. But now I have this opportunity to get back on the right foundation of truth and like really get rooted in Jesus and rebuild from there. Like, even though it sucks, and I wouldn't wish it for anybody to have to go through that to get to the point where you can finally just not necessarily start from scratch, but like when everything falls apart, like what else is there to stand on? I started healing. I started doing a lot of rebuilding, finding some community. I started coming back to the Bywords podcast and kind of starting to open up and share more about my story online. It's just interesting. Like, I didn't want that testimony, and I didn't expect God to use it in the ways that he has. But if I learned anything from that year, it was definitely that idea that when everything falls apart, you have the opportunity to build on the right foundation. And I have this amazing friend, Darby. She's been on the podcast before, but I remember processing some of that season with her, and she said something that I didn't want to hear, but it was so true. And I still see the truth in it to this day, looking back. But she said, Hannah, the breaking of you will be the making of you if you let it. And that is just really tough, like that's hard. Like, we don't want the hard stuff. We don't want it to be uncomfortable. We don't want to go through pain. But if we allow it, those moments can be what end up rebuilding us stronger on our faith, on a more sturdy foundation. And that's absolutely what I feel happened for me during that time in my life. So then we get to 2023 when I turned 29 last year, and Wow, what a whirlwind ride. I had gotten to a point in my life where I didn't know if I was willing to try again for another baby. I have shared this story before, but at fasting and prayer services at our church at the beginning of 2023, I just told the Lord, I am willing to try one more time, but then I just don't know if I can. Like, if it's your will for us to have another baby, great. Like, I trust you and I believe that you can make it happen. But if it's not, please take this desire away and, give us a desire for fostering or adopting if that's the path we need to take. And I just kind of like laid it all out there. And the next week, I found out that I was pregnant. And then we found out it was a girl and that it was Ardella. And it was just the sweetest time. This was the year that I went to Australia to see my friend Phoebe, who was also pregnant. Just so sweet, like kind of seeing prayers that I had prayed for so long be answered and kind of like living in those answered prayers was really sweet. And at the same time, things also got pretty hard at the end of last year. And again, I won't go into too much detail because I shared a lot of the process on the podcast as we were going through it in real time. But we were planning on buying a house in Texas and we were supposed to close the same week that Della was due. Della ended up coming early. Then she was in the NICU, and then we lost the house 3 days before closing. And so at this point, we were like, huh, maybe there's a shift happening here. Like something is changing. And a lot of things in our life started to feel that way. Like the grace was just lifting for a lot of things. And that's when we started praying and thinking about moving to Colorado. Well, it was just such a ride. And I think the lesson that I learned this past year has been bringing your pain and your doubts and your questions to Jesus can actually make your faith stronger if you let it. It's just been so crazy because when I think back to my early 20s, so wild to see how much my faith has changed. I used to think that I had to perform or earn God's goodness or act a certain way or be a perfect Christian and tick all the boxes and do all the perfect right things on paper. And now my faith journey has evolved so much and it's not perfect. Like y'all know, I talk a lot about the struggle and the real, honest faith, imperfect faith journey that so many of us are walking. And it's hard when we realize or come to terms with the fact that God's best for our lives doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy or comfortable. It means that He's just going to be with us in every season. And I think really in this past year, that's been one of the biggest things that I have learned in my faith in life in general is that God's goodness doesn't equal an easy life free of pain and struggles. It means that He's always with us. And so we do have hope. We have something to cling to in every season and every circumstance. This whole last year has been so opposite and so different from what I expected my life would look like. I mean, so much, again, so much can change in a year. In the past year, since turning 29, we went to New Zealand with our whole family. So we had our baby girl who was healthy, who was home with us. We got to go to New Zealand. We moved out of our barn dominium in Texas, which I literally thought we would never do. And we moved to Colorado. I started working retail at the mall, and I have found myself in the season of feeling hidden while still holding my dreams and my plans and my hopes for my future with an open hand. And I'm also, getting back into writing. And we found this church that we've connected to, and we're getting back into worship ministry. And it just feels hopeful. I still don't have it figured out. I thought that by the time that I was 30, I would know exactly who I am and exactly what my life will look like. And what I've learned by 30 is that we may never know exactly how things are going to look and things may not go according to plan at all. But the beauty of our faith, and I even said this the other day, I was speaking at an event and I was talking about how what's impressive about our faith isn't how well we know the Bible or how good we can be as believers. It's actually that we have something to hope for and cling to through the ups and downs of this life. Through every high and low, we have something that is consistent and never changing, and that is the hope of Jesus Christ and His Holy Spirit that's always with us, no matter what. We are never alone in any season, in any challenge, in any struggle, in any circumstance. That being said, as I've just reflected on this last decade and I prepare my heart for a future that may not look anything like I thought it would, I'm trusting that God knows better. And I already feel such a sense of relief in that kind of like and freedom and just excitement and anticipation. So some of the things that I'm hoping for this next decade are that my honest, raw, imperfect faith journey will continue to draw me closer in relationship with Jesus. And also, I hope to encourage other women in the same thing. Like, I want women to know your faith doesn't have to look perfect on paper. You don't have to be a perfect Christian. And you don't have to have a life free of struggles to know that God loves you. And I've just become so passionate about sharing the everyday faith journey, you know? And so I just really hope that I'll have more conversations with you guys and be able to share more about my own process and journey as it continues to unfold. I am dreaming about writing more books. I really am hoping that I will be able to write again. It's been so sweet having this podcast as a way to get content out into the world. But writing is really my first love. And so I really hope that I'll be able to come back to that in the next decade. I also hope that BioWords will keep growing through this podcast, through events. Man, we started doing in-person events in 2023 also, and it was so fun. And so I'm dreaming of doing more of that and maybe even a retreat. I don't know. Y'all let me know if that's something you would want. I think that would be so fun. I would also love to buy a house. That's a goal that I have for my 30s. I think that'd be great. If we are able to find a house in Colorado by some miracle in the next few years or in the next decade, that would be really cool. Another goal that I have is to find another mentor and to be a mentor. I just think that's so important. And in the transition moving here, I'm kind of starting over. So I want to find somebody who can help me continue to grow in my faith and in other areas as well. And then also, I just want to be able to pour out what I've received as well and like encourage other people in their walk, whether it's motherhood or faith or healing or, you know, those things. I just think it's so powerful when we come together and can like build each other up like that. My last thing is just continuing to build community in Colorado and in this little BioWords community we got going on in this side of the internet. And I just really hope that this next decade is marked by loving people really well and making a difference in those ways, not getting so caught up in the big achievements, but realizing that every purposeful thing we do, whether it's big or small, can point people to Jesus if we're loving our neighbor well and being intentional with what we've got right where we're at. That's where we're at, guys. Here's to 30. I cannot believe it. I can't believe we made it, y'all. I'm 30. What? That feels crazy. But people keep saying the 30s are the best, so I am hoping that is true. I don't know. We'll see. But here we go. Here's to the next decade. I love you guys. Thanks for coming on this journey with me, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in to another episode of the BioWords Show. I love having you here, and your support truly means the world to me. If you enjoyed this episode, would you leave a quick review? It really helps our community grow and reach more women. If you want more, you can shop my books, Waking Up, Living Open, and Love Is on Amazon, and be sure to sign up for my email list so you always get the latest news. I can't wait to chat again soon, but in the meantime, be sure to come hang out with me on social media, and remember, I'm cheering you on.